Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm KM Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There's no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's writing video. I am KM Weiland, and I run the writing website helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. So today I want to talk about theme. And I want to talk about it because I think this is a concept that there's a lot of misunderstanding around. I wrote an entire book about it because of this reason. It's called Writing Your Story's Theme, if you're interested in that. As always, there'll be more resources down below. So I want to talk about theme today because, as I say, I think it's something that there's a lot of confusion around. Specifically, I think when we think of theme, we often think of, maybe one letter or, short phrase, aphorisms, kind of like maybe the theme of the story is love, or maybe it's, overcoming a sense of unworthiness or something like that. And that's very possibly what the story is about and what the theme is pointing to. But that isn't necessarily a good roadmap for helping us learn how to write theme. So I think it's valuable to look a little deeper and to understand how theme actually operates within a story, what its function is, and therefore how you can use the other elements of your story to consciously create the theme you want to create. Now, there has been, at least in the past, kind of a common statement that floats around that writers should never consciously write theme. And there is some truth to this, which I'll talk about in just a second, but ultimately I adamantly disagree with this. And what I think that it's pointing to really is that we don't want to preach at readers, right? We don't want to try to start with some message that we're trying to share about the world and then shoehorn that into our characters' mouths or their perspective of the world and try to prove it, through whatever's happening in the story. You don't want to come into a story, say a romance or something, and say that the point of this is to prove, some political statement or something. Readers don't like that. It doesn't work. And it doesn't work within the story because it isn't organic or it doesn't flow. It feels like the author, even if they're not preaching at you, it still feels like they're trying to, jam some specific moral message into this story that doesn't fit. However, I think that this usually happens simply because the writer, has an idea of theme, but doesn't understand how it actually works within story form. And if you do understand that, number one, you're much less likely to, end up with fragmented themes where, your story's saying one thing and you're trying to say something else with the theme. Or, you get to the end and you realize, this is my story's theme or what I thought it was, and how do I make this work in the climax? It doesn't seem to have anything to do with what's actually happening. And so you can end up having either stories that seem very disjointed or, two different endings that are trying to address the plot and the theme. And it just creates a story that doesn't feel cohesive and resonant, right? But if you understand what you're doing and you understand where a theme comes from within a story, how it's created, then you can, number one, consciously create anything you want to create within the realm of your story. And number two, and perhaps most importantly, you can double check and troubleshoot what isn't working. So if you get to the end of the story and you feel like your theme is off the rails or non-existent, you can go back and check what happened and where do I need to work with the story in order to make the theme more powerful and pertinent. Okay, so what is theme really within story form? So the most important thing to understand about theme is that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not its own thing within the story. It's part of the greater whole. And specifically, it forms, what I call the trifecta, triangle of plot, character, and theme. They create each other. They do not exist by themselves in isolation. One necessarily creates the other. And, we hear this talked about sometimes in regards to the idea of plot versus character, as if they were two totally separate things. when really they can't be. The plot has to create the character has to create the plot. Well, theme is the third part of that. And here's the thing, if you have a functional story that's working, right? Maybe you don't know why, but it's working, and hallelujah, right? What that means is that all three of those things are working, even if you're not conscious of them, even if you didn't do it on purpose, so to speak. If they're working, it means that all three are in cohesion with one another, and that's what you want. So if you can bring consciousness to it, then you can do it on purpose, even when it's not working and you have no idea why not. So anytime that you come up with an idea, let's just say for a plot, right? Necessarily there has to be characters in that plot. So it may take a little time, but as you flesh out that plot in your mind, you begin to understand what kind of people are driving this plot, what kind of people are interested in going to the places and achieving the things that you want to see happen in this plot. So necessarily you have characters come online. And vice versa, if you start with an idea for a character, obviously you don't have anything for them to do until there's a plot. So, pretty soon you start getting ideas for what are they going to do? What are they interested in? How are they interacting with other people? What do they want? What are they moving toward? And suddenly you have a plot. They're not separate, right? One necessarily creates and brings with it the other. And the same is true of theme. And particularly once you have that interaction between plot and character, it's kind of like the engine that creates theme. So when you look at character arc, which we talked about this in the last video about the lie the character believes and how that creates this entire arc of the character's evolution as they change their perspective, as they evolve into a new way of being and a new identity within the world, that's character arc. And that is something that has to be acted upon, right? It's not just something that's happening in the character's head, or there's no reason for it really. It's a dream. It's a expression of philosophy. It's not a story. You have to bring that into the action of the plot and prove what the character is going through, dramatize it, show it, right, through the events of the plot. So the events of the plot and the arrival of whatever the conflict is what prompts the need for this change within the character. And then the change within the character, as they change, it allows them to evolve and grow what they're doing in the plot. Because if they stayed the same as they are at the beginning, then they either aren't going to go on this adventure at all, or depending on the type of story, they're going to die, right? They've got to evolve in order to survive. They've got to evolve in order to reach this next level of whatever it is the story's wanting them to achieve, whether that's a relationship or a new job or saving the world or whatever the case may be. And in some stories, some quiet literary stories, it really is just about changing that inner landscape. But it has to be proven in some way, acted out in some way within the plot. I like to think of the plot as sort of a metaphor for whatever the character is changing internally, for the story's lie and truth. So you start, let's just say, you start with the character's lie and truth, and from there you ask yourself, what events, what plot, what can the character do physically in the world that would dramatize and show this inner transformation from lie to truth, right? So let's just say an easy example of this would be the Hunger Games, which is a flat arc, right? So she doesn't change her perspective. She doesn't grow from lie to truth, but she uses her understanding of the truth to change the world around her. And in this case, it would be her understanding, that oppression is no good, right? That this lie that has been fed to Panem, her country, by its oppressive government is that, their control is necessary to protect them and blah, blah, blah. And the brutality of the Hunger Games is also necessary. And, she realizes this is not true, as many people in her world does. But what makes her an interesting Katniss, what makes her an interesting character and protagonist, is that her story gives her the opportunity to act on that truth. And specifically in this story, we can see how the entire Hunger Games, right? The entire scope of what the plot is in this story is, a very specific dramatization of her story's lie and truth that allows her to, go out and actively battle this oppression. She's basically put in a cage and has to fight her way out. So that's a very explicit example of how that might work. So You've got plot and you've got character, and they're working together beautifully, right? One is proving the other, we might say. And from this, we get theme. No matter what is happening in your story, even if you try to paste on a different kind of a theme, the events of your story and how your character responds to them and interacts with them, that is what creates the theme, inevitably. That is the point of your story. That is the message of your story. And the thematic truth that will be proved by the end of your story is whatever is shown by the events of the story, of the plot, to be effective for the characters, whether they themselves embrace this or not. Whatever is effective in your story is your story's truth. And that can be something very practical, like a skill, but it can also be just a perspective of themselves or the world. Like I say, it could be like self-worth or something like that. So when you approach story from this idea that plot, theme, and character are all equal members of the equation, and that necessarily one creates the other, it allows you to make sure that you're creating this really cohesive cycle. And also when you're, running into problems, you can stop and check. So let's just say you're having problems with your theme. I don't know what my theme is. Well, stop. Look at what your character's arc is, and specifically look at the lie they believe. Look at, whatever they are needing to overcome by the time they get to the end of the story, and therefore what truth they're moving into, because that truth is usually a very specific and very easy way to sum up what your story's theme is. But you can also look at the events of the plot. What are they doing? What is happening? What is challenging them? Where are they failing? What do they have to do to succeed? How do they have to change in order to become someone who can succeed in the gaining the plot goal within your story? That's kind of where you can start looking for theme, and vice versa. If you know your theme, let's just say you start out knowing, like, I want to write a story about love conquers all, right? That's your theme. That's what you want to write about. Well, there's no reason you can't start with that. It's just now you have a map for helping you determine, what kind of characters and what kind of character arc will help me exemplify this. How will they be challenged to grow into this? What lie might oppose this idea? And what events of the plot will be an interesting way to explore all aspects of this idea. And this is where it can be really helpful to bring in a technique that Robert McKee wrote about in his book Story, and he called the Thematic Square. And what this is examining, whatever your story's thematic truth is from multiple perspectives, so that it's not just this simple black and white, this is the wrong way to do it and this is the right way to do it, right? Because that's very simplistic and can be very on the nose and ultimately unconvincing to readers, because that's not really how it works for most of us most of the time in real life. If it was that simple, we'd be like, truth, I want to do that, that one, I picked that one, because obviously it's better. Obviously it's going to be more effective and help me get what I want, what I need, what's good for me. But it's not that simple, right? There's many shades and complexities to this evolution of perspective. Because as I spoke about in the last video, it's really not that you have a black and white lie and truth. It's that they represent an evolution along a spectrum from a limited perspective to a broader perspective. So you want to be able, ideally, to explore some of the complexities that are around this idea. So a useful tool for doing that is Robert McKee's Thematic Square. I've written about it myself, so I will leave a link to his book as well down below. But basically, simply what it is you create a square, right, with 4 corners that represent 4 different sides or points on the thematic premise that you're exploring. So first and foremost, you have positive. Positive is the truth, right? This is the good stuff that you're trying to posit in your story. Like, this is the way we should be. Whether the characters embrace it and succeed or fail to embrace it and fail within the story, this is the positive truth that you are suggesting is the best way for the characters to behave in this story. So examples of this would be respect or love, right? These are good qualities. These are things that we recognize as being ideally something we want to be able to embody in our lives, and that will help us to be more effective in whatever we're doing. Now, opposed to that is contradictory. So this is something that, is directly contradictory to this positive truth. So this would, at its simplest, be the lie. This is what stands opposed to the story's truth. So in just these really, simple one-word explanations of what these might be, in opposition to respect, we would have disrespect, right? In opposition to love, we would have hate. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Okay, so that those two are obvious. They're an obvious polarity. And then you can start moving, go down to the bottom corners of your square and think about, first of all, what would be an element within this thematic exploration that would be contrary to the positive. So the word contrary always makes me think of like somebody who's being contrary, like they're just being annoying, like they're just being stubborn and refusing to see things. It's not necessarily that they, represent or are directly opposed to the argument, but that they're just refusing to do it. Like, they're opting out, like whatever, talk to the hand, as we used to say. And so something in this realm would be something that's just kind of like, it's something that wants to bypass the whole thing. And therefore, in some ways, is more dangerous than the contradictory aspect, which at least is looking, it's looking at the truth. It's looking it in the eye and doing battle with it, kind of. Where the contrary aspect just wants to, like, skip it, like, I don't even want to engage with this truth. So an example of this would be, for respect, it could be rudeness. It's not about disrespect per se. It's just about, disrespect being, an ultimate, like, I have no respect for you. Rudeness is kind of passive aggressive, right? It's just like, like I don't respect you, but, I'm not actually doing you the service of coming to your face and telling you that either. Whereas, for love, the principle of love, this could be indifference, right? Which in many ways can be more painful than hate in some, some relationships, so to speak. We often say that, love is, hate is just love flipped on its head. And, the idea being, if you can dig down there in hate, you might be able to find in the shadow that love and integrate it. Whereas indifference is just like, I don't care. Like, you don't exist to me. You're dead to me. Like, I don't think about you at all. Which can be more painful and certainly more difficult to move through if it's really embedded, to move toward that more positive truth. And then finally, we have what McKee calls the negation of the negation. And this is like the contradictory aspect, the lie, taken to its farthest extreme. It's taken to such an extreme that it's as if the truth doesn't exist. So it's like rewriting reality to a place where the true aspect doesn't even exist. And this would be where the character might end up if they reject the truth, right? They have the opportunity, they're given an opportunity over the course of the story to see this is true and, could potentially positively impact my life, but for whatever reason they reject it, and it ends them in a worse place than they were in when they just believed the lie or the contradictory aspect. So in our example of respect, this would be the negation of the negation would be self-disrespect, right? It's an aspect where not only, because if you are disrespecting someone else, there's that place within your own ego where even though it's very egoic, you are still standing within your own sense of identity and pride of self, in opposition to something else. But if self-respect, if you can't even respect yourself, if there isn't even that ego container to hold your own identity, then that is in many ways a worse place to be than if you're just this, egoic person who's disrespecting everybody else. Because you can't respect other people either if you're in that space. So you can see how it's like in a plague almost, right? Where whatever the seed of the lie was, just kind of can take over the entire person's being and life and perhaps beyond, depending on the type of story you're telling. And in McKee's example that he uses for love, this would be self-hatred. Again, it's just, it's moving it into such a place where love doesn't even exist in your universe. And one of the best ways to explore this, obviously you can choose to have your protagonist and your antagonist represent, any one of these, and the polarity, as the opposition, depending on whether you're telling, a positive change arc or a flat arc or a negative change arc. But you can also, really interesting way to really deepen this thematic complexity and this argument is to look for ways where you can have, multiple characters, at least 4 characters, represent the different aspects of this so that the protagonist gets a chance to interact with all of them, to be challenged by all of them, to see the pros and the cons of each one so that they're challenged. It's not a simple binary choice between, oh, the lie is bad and the truth is better, so of course I'll choose the truth. But to move through all of these shadow aspects of the lie and the truth and to explore them and to be challenged by them. So that can be a really interesting and deep way to deepen not just your theme, but again, if you're like using characters to represent these aspects, it also is like something that really helps you develop and deepen the opportunities for your plot. And look for ways to make sure that every character within the plot, everything that's happening, any opposition the character is facing from antagonistic forces, that it's all thematically pertinent, right? It's not random. It's not like the character is trying to move toward a truth of love, and then over here you have somebody who's, talking about freedom and slavery. That's a totally different theme. And it can definitely have crossover because, ultimately everything is very interconnected in real life. But it can help you recognize, like, this is really not the point of my story. This is not the plot through line. Doesn't have to do with the character's individual arc. How could we repurpose this so that it actually does inform the theme that we're talking about within this story? So again, and one last thing to think about in how you integrate theme, particularly into your plot and your character arc, is to look at how your story ends, right? Because the ending of your story, your climactic moment, will prove what your story was really about. And therefore it will prove what your theme really is. So the decisions your character makes in the end, the perspectives that they use to inform their choices and what they do and whether or not they're able to gain their plot goal. All of those things will reveal what your story's theme is really about. And a simple way to just look at this is to just examine the questions that your story raises and the answers it ultimately ends up giving. And this does not mean that you need to end with some kind of moral of the story or where the mentor character comes out, and gives a little speech about what was, the lesson to be learned or something like that. The answer is simply in whether or not the character was effective in how they end at the end of the story. Do they end in a better place physically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, or is it a worse place? If it's a better place, then the story's truth, the answer to the questions that have been raised, is yes, this is an effective way of being in the world. This is a good course of action. If they fail, ambiguously or definitively, then what the story's saying is like, no, this is not a good way of being. And it becomes, even without any need, to create a moral of the story, it becomes a cautionary tale of sorts. And finally, related to this is just think about how your story will develop change and consequence, right? Because change, specifically within the character arc, and also how they are able to enact change in the outer world of the story, will prove, what the story is really about. It will show you, how the theme develops, the thematic questions that are at play, and the answers that you ultimately come up with. And also specifically think about consequences, right? Now, consequences can be good in the sense of like cause and effect and something good happens. But particularly as we think of consequences as something that's, a hard pill to swallow. Because not only can that sometimes prove like, oops, the character did not choose the best way of being. They did not choose the story's truth. But it can also, be this really resonant way to drive home that, this path of change, this path of evolution that we're all on within our lives isn't easy. Like, it's not cut and dried. It's not black and white. Again, if it was just lie, truth, this is worse and this is better, we'd always choose the truth. And there would be no need for stories because we'd always choose the right thing. But stories show us, that there are in fact consequences for choosing, the right thing, for choosing what's best for us, for choosing something that, we believe is in the best interest of ourselves and our communities and our world. That it's not simple, that there are sacrifices, that letting go of the lie or dealing with people who aren't ready for us to let go of the lie, or things like that, they're not easy, that embracing the truth is often difficult. So in looking at the consequences that your characters face or could face if you deepen your story, can be really helpful in showing you not just what your story's theme is, but how you can really deepen it and explore all of the depth of it. Go into the shadows and explore the profundity of change, which is really ultimately what theme in story is about. So I know that's a lot. Theme is a very abstract concept. I do find pulling it in and thinking of it through terms of plot and character makes it more concrete and easy to master within your story. And again, I've written a whole book about theme. So if you want more, you can check out Writing Your Story's Theme, and I will leave links and resources to some other stuff. I will see you again in the next video. And until then, happy writing. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at authorkmwyland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/kmwyland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of Helping Writers Become Authors.